Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday webcast on behalf of the Montessori Foundation and the International Montessori Council. I'm Kathy Leach, and I'm joined here today by our good friend and colleague, Jonathan Wolf. Jonathan works closely on the IMC Board of Trustees as well as a senior management or senior consultant with the Montessori Foundation. So you see Jonathan all over the country, all over the world, bringing lots of inspiring words to many of us. I'm also joined by our regular panelist and our presenter today, Dr. Michael Dorer. Michael, also senior consultant with the Montessori Foundation and has been involved in teacher education in many respects, mostly concentrated on elementary education for many years. So we're here to learn from Michael's wisdom today on management and leadership, kind of what I call the rebooting for the new year. Happy New Year to everyone. Most everybody is either back to school or getting back to school very soon. So we're all ready for that reboot and fresh start. So Michael, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Kathy. And hi, Jonathan. Good to have you join us.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Happy New Year to everybody. I want to echo what Kathy just said. It is a new year, and I hope you had some time over a break, if you got one, and I hope you did, to reflect a little about practice in your classroom and your school. It's a good time to do that. And I think that the traditional school year that has a break sometime in the summer, sometime in the spring, sometime in the fall, does offer us an opportunity to do exactly that. If we want to take the time to reflect, then that time usually is there. And I think we should want to take that time because Montessori work, or in fact any work with children probably, is a work that benefits from reflection. And taking the time sometimes is hard to do because we've got so many other things on us. But it's good when we can do that. One of the things I've reflected about is management or leadership in the Montessori classroom. It seems to me that that is something that we don't get a lot of when we're doing our Montessori teacher education. As a teacher educator and as a person who took Montessori training as a student in 4 different times, I can testify that it's very, it gets the short shrift. It doesn't get covered as much as it later seems to need to be. And that's verified by a research project that John Chatton McNichols did about a dozen years ago, in which he asked graduates from a wide variety of Montessori programs, AMI, AMS. This was prior to CGMS, but a number of various organizations, to rank various elements of their training as to how comprehensive it was. And no matter who it was, elementary, early childhood, adolescent, AMI, AMS, MEPI, classroom management came in last. So it was not stressed. That's not to say it isn't important, though. It's just that so many other things are important that somehow it gets shoved aside. Maybe this is a good time to look at that topic. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at management and or leadership. Let's decide what it is. And I'm going to spend a little time on this because I think it's probably one of the most misunderstood things about classroom management is what we're even talking about. Here's a quote from Daniel Duke. He wrote this in a book called Classroom Management in 1978, and it was really in the 1970s that the concept of classroom management as a study and a topic emerged. So listen, he wrote, classroom management constitutes the procedures necessary to establish and maintain an environment in which instruction and learning can occur. Okay, I see some really important words there, and we're going to come back and talk about those, but one of those important words is environment. Another one is procedures, and another one is instruction and learning. Okay, here's another one. The APA, American Psychological Association, says classroom management is the process by which teachers and schools create and maintain appropriate behavior of students in classroom settings. Wow, that's really different, isn't it? The difference is all of a sudden we're talking about behavior of students. We're not talking about creating an environment or anything like that. The appropriate behavior of students in classroom settings. And now this one from Elizabeth Mulvihill, she wrote, simply put, classroom management refers to the wide variety of skills and techniques that teachers use to ensure that their classroom runs smoothly without disruptive behavior from students. I'm going to go back to those three. Just take a second here. That first one by Duke, I put in red what I think were really key: procedures, establish and maintain an environment, and where instruction and learning can occur. Those three things. Procedures. That means having a routine, having a plan, establish and maintain an environment. We in Montessori, I think, will buy into that because the prepared environment is foundational to what it is that we do. So the idea that preparing and maintaining an environment is the first thing. He first mentions procedures, then environment, that's one of the most important things in classroom management. I think we can buy into that. And of course, we want it to be a place where not only instruction, but obviously learning can occur. Now, this second one, look at what they've got: process, which is very much like procedure, and then this part about behavior. And in the third one, I think what she talked about that was really key was a wide variety of skills and techniques, and also that the classroom runs smoothly. And then she mentioned the lack of disruption, that we get away from that. Okay, so what if I put those all together? I put them all together, and this is what we end up with: an organized system. And the part in white is what I added just to make it work. An organized system of procedures and processes which call upon teachers' wide variety of skills and techniques to establish and maintain a classroom environment which runs smoothly and in which successful instruction and learning can occur. This supports the creation and maintenance of appropriate behavior of students without disruption. I'm going to use that as the definition that I think works for us. Again, the key words in here are procedures, processes, a wide variety of skills and techniques, a classroom environment, runs smoothly, successful learning and instruction can take place, and appropriate behavior of students. Which, by the way, you notice, appropriate behavior of students is the last sentence. And that's purposeful. It's because there is a very great misconception, as you saw in that second definition by the American Psychological Association, that that's all it's about, is behavior. It's about discipline. Discipline and management aren't the same thing. I'm going to skip that one for a moment because I want to come back to it at another time. But before we get into it, do we really need classroom management? Here's what it does. Good classroom management should sustain an orderly environment. It increases academic learning, and it actually helps children in their social and emotional growth. And it decreases negative behaviors, so more time is spent actually engaged properly. Here's an interesting thing. If we think it's needed, even though classroom management produces all sorts of positive outcomes, according to a survey that APA did construct. APA, again, is the American Psychological Association. Even so, teachers indicated that chaotic classrooms are a big issue for them across the country. By the way, this was not done in Montessori. This is a broad variety of schools all over the place where teachers are saying chaotic environments are a problem, and it causes teacher stress, and it causes teacher burnout. So, if we know that it has these positive effects that I just talked about a moment ago up here, that it sustains an orderly environment, it increases meaningful learning, it facilitates emotional growth, it decreases negative behaviors, and if it isn't there, It causes teachers to have high stress and high burnout. Well, then it seems that we really need to pay attention to this thing. We really need to pay attention to it in terms of having a class that runs smoothly, in having a teacher who doesn't burn out and doesn't have high stress, unnecessary stress, and at the same time that we have successful instruction and learning so that the children are benefiting to the maximum from being in the classroom. These are all good things. We do need a management system. When I took Montessori training, and strangely enough, Kathy knows this because we talked about this a little while ago, but this 2019 is my 50th year in Montessori. So that's a half a century of messing up more than once in many ways in Montessori and learning from those mistakes. When I first started, there was no mention of classroom management whatsoever, except for this. The Montessori classroom always runs perfectly and smoothly, and there's never a behavior problem. But if there ever is, it's your problem because you did something wrong. That was our entire instruction on classroom management, so that we could own the entire guilt if anything went wrong in the classroom ever. There were never any ways to solve that problem other than by, well, be a good Montessorian. So we've come a long ways, I think, I hope, from that. But I think a lot of us are still into that idea, and that's why we have the burnout and the stress, because we take it upon ourselves for every last thing. Good classroom management has to be planned. Remember that second definition that the American Psychological Association said classroom management is about behavior of children. They are thinking, and they're telling us what many people believe, that classroom management is about people. It's about children and their behavior, and that they need to be disciplined. There needs to be a discipline plan. But I want us to understand that, at least from my perspective, classroom management that is planned and discipline are different things. Having a plan of rules and punishment, or consequences, as many people like to say, and having a management plan are different. The rules and consequences, if we focus on monitoring tight discipline instead of having an overall management plan, then that's going to continue day after day, week after week, year after year, because we'll always be putting out fires. If we have an overall plan, the fires don't have to start in the first place. Or if they're extinguished, they don't have to come back up again and again and again, and you can become a teacher, a guide, rather than a fireman. Without a management plan, absent any management plan, which many of us are like that, what could possibly go wrong? I like this picture. This is what could go wrong. You end up all tied up, nowhere to go, and not knowing what to do.
Well, I have to interrupt you for just a moment.
All right.
Because we're Montessorians. We don't need a plan. We follow the child. We just do what we think is right.
Yeah, and if you want to put that
being devil's advocate a little bit here, Michael.
If you want to put that into the context of this slide I just brought up, that is actually the very first thing in the top left, reactive. If we're going to do that, we're in a reactive mode all the time. We're reacting to the children, to their perceived wants, which many people call needs, even though they may not be a need, but maybe a want. We're constantly driven by problems, by issues. And our issue is stop the bad behavior. And that's a negative orientation, really. It's not a positive orientation. I'm not saying there isn't bad behavior, but if that's our focus, it's the wrong focus. Yes, we want to follow the child. I would just point out to you, though, that phrase showed up in the absorbent mind in the Indian translation when Montessori was writing about how to take a walk with a toddler. And as you know, Kathy, she said, when walking with a toddler, let the toddler lead and then you should follow the child. I think that's good advice. I don't know if it's meant to go any further than that, but that's where it appeared. And I have a grandson who's a toddler, and so I do exactly that. I follow him when he takes a walk rather than pulling him along. Well, she did say in that same passage that we should use this as an inspiration for our work with children in general. An inspiration and a dictum are two different things. I can be inspired by that, but I also have day-to-day management issues that I have to deal with. So I tend to rephrase it and say, it's our task to follow childhood. We need to follow what we know about children. But one of the things I know is that if I put into place a reactive plan, that it's going to draw attention to the negative behaviors repeatedly, and that's not what I want to do. It's not, because it's actually going to rebound against exactly what it is I'm trying to set up. Let's compare this discipline thing then with management. Management, instead of being reactive, should be basically proactive. That means making a plan before an incident occurs. It means it's driven by by productivity, by the outcome at the end, instead of by the problem. And again, it promotes responsibility, which, by the way, is one of our big things, I think, in Montessori. We'd like to see responsibility among, well, ourselves as well as the children. And it produces more predictable behavior. Just look at the difference. Produce predictable behavior as opposed to stopping deviant behavior. One is negative, one is positive. The discipline orientation tends to look at problems and how we can solve them. There are problems, I'm not going to deny that. But if that becomes our orientation, if that becomes our whole focus, it starts to color the way we view children and color the way we view the classroom in terms of the problems that we're trying to stamp out.
Michael?
That's the right way to go. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, one of the metaphors I like to use for the really well-taken point that you're making is a medical model. You know, if a doctor only looks at symptoms, he's gonna cut it out of the body or give it some medicine to get rid of the symptoms, and that's not preventive medicine. What I think you're talking about on the management side is really preventive medicine, how to create a plan and a culture of self-directed responsibility, which is very different than stopping out symptoms of bad behavior.
That's right. The doctor and the teacher both do want to get rid of those symptoms at some point. But that's not the biggest overall issue. That's why they call it now health care instead of disease care.
Yeah.
They're interested in maintenance of health, which, by the way, should have the side effect of eliminating those bad things that come up.
Exactly.
If they do come up, we need to deal with them. But I'm going to focus first on an overall management plan. Thanks for that, John. Let's just think about, again, what would happen, what's the difference? Discipline and having regular procedures. Discipline, which many people think of as management, is connected with how children behave. If we have a procedural orientation, we're concerned with how we do things. That's really a big difference. I like that little cartoon down there. For your punishment, write 100 times, I will not waste my time on meaningless tasks. There's your discipline plan, and that's what we don't want to do. Okay, let's talk about management. It means organization and procedures. That's what it really is going to be able to mean. Procedures organize the classroom. Procedures like grace and courtesy. Grace and courtesy is teaching children procedures, how to do a certain thing, how to greet someone, how to shake hands, how to say thank you. And that creates responsible skills. It creates responsibility that can actually be lifelong. If you're consistent about this, having a consistent approach, is proactive. Before children misbehave, before there's this problem where we have to have them write 100 times, I won't do meaningless tasks, before this ever comes up, we show the appropriate way to perform some particular task. This is the right way to greet someone, how to sit by someone, how to ask if you can work with them, and so on. Now I'm going to turn to a little bit different thing. Sometimes I've gone to Montessori conferences and I've heard people say classroom management is wrong, wrong, wrong. It's out, 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 and it's a thing of the past. What we need to use is the term classroom leadership. Well, which should we use? Classroom management or classroom leadership, and does it really matter anyway which one we use? What should we call it? Well, there is a difference, because management and leadership refer to slightly different things. Listen to what Admiral Grace Murray Hopper said: you manage things, you lead people. Here's the deal. In our Montessori classroom, we have both. We have things and we have people. It's not an either or, but we need to find a balance between what we do with things and people so that they balance out. If we have that leadership orientation, that it's all about the children in the classroom, we forget about the procedures we need to do. We forget about the environment. We forget about the materials. But on the other hand, if we think only of those things, we forget about the people. They need to be in balance. So management and leadership are both terms that work. But classroom leadership tends to talk mostly about discipline issues, mostly about problems and how to cure them. That's not the prime orientation. So where do we start? Do we start working with things or with people? We need to start with things because the things influence the people. In other words, the layout of the environment itself, is critical to the way children behave, act, learn, and perform within that environment. That's why, instead of just thinking about the leadership of the children, I think we need to think about the creation of a learning environment first as step one in any management plan. Okay, so I've kind of come full circle here back to your Montessori training, because I think in Montessori training, one of the first things we learn about is you have to have a prepared environment. But maybe that wasn't framed as step one of a management plan, which it actually is. And then when people talk about management, they tend to forget that. And they talk about, in fact, discipline issues and the leadership focus on the people and what they're doing. Without that proper environment, we're going to always be struggling with the children in the classroom and with the behaviors. So let's use the term, I'm going to use the term management, and you can think of it as including leadership, and I'm going to talk about 6 essential management areas. These 6 management areas are managing the environment, managing planning, managing lessons, managing time, managing behavior, and actually managing yourself. Oh yeah, I have to take charge of myself too. And that's a management task, by the way. Managing the environment, planning, lessons, time, behavior, and yourself are in an order for a reason. And you'll notice, except for yourself, I put that at the end because I wanted to build up to it, but that penetrates every single one of these areas. But the reason I put behavior sort of at the end of the others is because it should be an outcome of appropriate management of the environment, appropriate planning, delivery of quality lessons, being on a time schedule that works, should lead to general behavior which is appropriate. But if we start with behavior, we're all the way back to that discipline deal that we're trying to get away from. There are actually some other management areas, like managing your curriculum delivery. I didn't put that in here today because I'm currently doing a whole course on that particular topic. That's an 8-week long course, and that's so big, I couldn't fit it in here, but that's another critical area. How do you actually manage the delivery of content? Record keeping. Managing record keeping is another thing that we have had as a separate presentation, a whole webcast on more than one occasion, because it's a big thing. Managing the other personnel, how you work with, or this is a leadership one, how you work with aides, assistants, the art teacher, the music instructor, with everybody else in the school, that's another issue. And then there's working with parents. These 4 are important management issues. They just couldn't fit into the timeline, the context that I've got to be able to do this in 2 webinars because they're so big. But each one of those has been the topic of 1 or more of our webcasts already. So when you think of it, there are really 10 management issues. I'm going to deal with 6 of the essential management issues this week and next week for us. Let's look at those 6. Here they are. And they all are essentially co-equal here. Managing the environment is on top because it's first. If you put all of these together, we have a management plan. And I have a presentation plan today and next week. And that is, I'm going to do these one at a time. I'm going to start by talking about the environment. Then I'm going to talk about planning. And then I'm going to talk about lessons. And if I'm very, very, very lucky, I'll get through all of those today, but I don't know. And then next week, I'll complete the managing lessons, talk about time, talk about behavior, and then talk about your behavior, my behavior, our own management plan for ourselves, which, by the way, could become a webinar unto itself, too. All right, now that's my plan of work. So I kind of have a program, a management plan for what it is we're going to do with the webinar, just like I'm suggesting we have a management plan in a classroom. Now, before I talk about why we're talking with environment first, let's just think. The Montessori guide we're taught in training has 4 roles. The Montessori guide has more than 4 roles that other teachers, conventional teachers, have too, like taking roll, doing a lunch count, or meeting with parents, filling out forms. But these are 4 special roles for Montessorians, and they're in order. The first one is preparing the environment. Then there's the task of observing. Well, why is that second? Because first you have to have an environment in which you observe. So first you build the environment, you prepare it, as Montessori says. Now we can do observation. That's going to inform our third task, which is presenting instruction, which shouldn't happen without observation. We need to have a database, that is what we gain from observing, in order to be effective in teaching. So when we're presenting our presentations or our lessons, that's an outcome of observing in the environment, and all this happens there in the environment. And finally, one that penetrates all the time is being a model. And that is something that isn't scheduled. Whether you like it or not, whatever you're doing with the children, whenever you're in the classroom, they see it. And you're modeling. And when you do things that you wish you hadn't done, or you make mistakes, or you get fed up or frustrated, you're still on the stage as far as they're concerned. So that's something that we have to take very, very seriously about what should we be consciously doing to be an appropriate model. And as you already probably know, that's what I'm going to talk about in managing yourself. So we're going to get to that. We're really going to look at all of these tasks, not so much on observing, though, because that, again, is part of an entire set of presentations we've done here as webcasts already.
Michael, we have a comment here from Mary Anderson. Can you go back to that graphic for just a moment that you had?
The one with the hexagons?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Here.
There you go. Okay, so Mary says, thank you for this synthesis, Michael. This should be part of every new teacher orientation at the building level. Also an excellent refresher. So you've given us this in a context, visually it helps people see kind of how the flow goes. And I agree with Mary. This really helps as a great refresher and probably be very helpful for new teachers. Do you use that in your teacher education programs, this particular graphic or model?
Well, yes, I do. But this particular graphic is something I made, and there's other ways to present this information. So I'm not trying to say you have to copy this, although you're welcome to. But
No, I don't see it that way. I just think it's, a lot of us are really helped by seeing it in a visual context,
and I think so too. So I do use it in training, but here's the thing: in training, many of the trainees who are taking the Montessori teacher education program, these teacher candidates, they haven't yet been in the classroom, so it's hard for them to understand only theoretically what classroom management means. Once they're engaged with kids, once they're in the classroom on a daily basis with children, that's when it becomes really clear that there is indeed a need for a management plan.
well, perhaps the context of being in the classroom, and I think Mary's really referring to that because she was talking about new teacher orientation. So as you go in and start the year with people, or as I call this half year, the sort of rebooting, the opportunity to start over again and remind and refresh ourselves. So I agree with Mary on that one. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Mary. I appreciate you bringing that up. That's really helpful. Okay, so I just talked about the 4 roles. And since the environment is the teacher's first role and an ongoing role, and by the way, that is the adult's role. That's our role. It's not the role of, if there's an assistant in the classroom, that's not the role of the assistant that the guide should say, why don't you do all the cleanup in the classroom? Why don't you arrange things and so on? They can participate, but ultimate responsibility with preparing the environment is the first task of the Montessori guide. And we have to accept that task because maintaining the environment is actually the core not only of our instruction, but of our management. So let's talk about it. Managing the environment. That's a biggie. I want to go through the general ideas of the environment. It is the guide's first role. When is it you do this preparation? The preparation of the environment is ongoing. When many people took training, they somehow thought, maybe if I set up the environment a week or 2 or 3 before school starts, my environmental preparation is done. But that leads to the environment being degraded over time because simple use, even if it's careful use, is going to require ongoing upkeep and maintenance. So really, I like Nancy Rambush's term, the preparing environment, as opposed to our traditional Montessori term, the prepared, because prepared sounds like it's in the past tense, that you've already done that. And in fact, it's an ongoing thing. It's a preparing constantly. It's an everyday task to maintain and continue to prepare the environment. And it's the task of the Montessorian. Here's some general guidelines. Spare. I use the word spare to describe what I'd like to see in the environment, as opposed to full, overfull, or horrors, cluttered. Cluttered is probably on the other end of the scale from spare. But it's a tendency that many of us have because we find interesting things or fun things or cute things or whatever, and we begin to add those to our environment. And as we add, or maybe we go to a workshop somewhere and we discover something, or we tour another school and we see something interesting. And as we bring all those in, we tend to forget that for everything you bring in, maybe something needs to go out. Because in balance, if we only keep adding things, Clutter is the ultimate outcome.
Michael?
Clutter does not work. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I think most of us would agree that most children today, certainly in Western society, certainly in the United States, are a tad overstimulated, whether it's too much screen time, diet, whatever it is. So if we agree that there is a tendency that children are overstimulated, then I think where Michael's going here, that less is more, is a good rule of thumb.
It is. I thank you for saying that. Yeah, it's always been the case, I think, but more so now. More so now than probably before. Now, let's look at these other things. These are fairly standard things that we know. You need a full range of Montessori materials, but get rid of the other stuff. The reason we don't want the other things out there is that they can distract the child from the actual tested materials, the actual things that we know were developed by Maria Montessori or are developed by her close followers like Mario Montessori, these key things that we want to be sure children engage with. But often, if we put other things in, they may be things that children relate to because it may be tied to something else, like Disney, or it may be very brightly colored and plastic and or make a noise or do other sorts of things. And that can distract them from what it is we want them to do. Now, this business about shelf groupings, I think, is sort of basic, but I just want to be sure that I mention it, that logical shelf groupings means you have areas in the classroom based on the content of what's there, like a area for sensorial, an area for geography, an area for practical life, so that the classroom is organized by its areas, by its space, but not necessarily by time. So geography has a place in the classroom, but it doesn't have a time. We don't say that from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock, kids, is geography time. From 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock is your math time. Instead of we organize our classrooms by time, we organize them by space. And that's why a lot of people think that Montessori is unorganized. They don't understand that orientation. I've been in classrooms, I was in one in Asia this fall, in which the teacher was very proud to show me that she'd organized the classroom with all of the red materials on certain shelves, blue went in another place, green in another place. No, that's not it. It's not that all the red materials go together, it's that all the sensorial materials go together. Some of those sensorial materials may be red, like the red rods or some of the knobless cylinders, but that doesn't mean they go with the addition material, which is also red, or with the unit beads, which may be red. So we've got to be careful that when we organize the shelf groupings, they are logical, not just on some sort of whim. And then they need to be really clean and clutter-free, and I've mentioned that already. The shelves are best if they are very light colored. And I'll tell you what, a lot of us, excuse me, and I'm one of them, I love the look of natural wood. But if you have a very light colored wood like birch, or even a white or cream shelf, you solve a field ground problem in which the Montessori materials stand out against the background, and the focus on the shelves should be the materials, not the shelf itself. The shelf itself is actually only the display material. The actual things like those things I just mentioned, the red rods, the cylinder blocks, the knobless cylinders, that's where we want the child's focus to be. So those stand out best against a neutral background. All right. By the way, don't make the shelves so deep that they're dark back inside. If they are dark back inside, if you paint the inside of the back of the shelf white, it will reflect light into the shelf and make it seem lighter so that the materials stand out more nicely. All right. These are some things that I really think are important in the classroom beauty. If you can make your classroom beautiful, you've achieved a lot. A beautiful classroom and a cluttered classroom probably don't work at the same time. So that's one of the first steps, is declutter it. But then I like this idea. My wife, Rose, who is a Montessori teacher, speaks a lot about points of beauty. She tries to create certain things in the classroom here or there that are exceptionally beautiful. A place where there is a particular flower arrangement, and then there's a little track light that focuses on that, for example. Things that are very beautiful, that are intentionally there for the purpose of beauty. They're not materials that you're going to use. They're things that help with the classroom becoming warm, beautiful. Other things like featuring certain materials, being very orderly, having art in the classroom, using various kinds of lighting, these can all add to the beauty in the classroom. But I want to say, I think this is something that maybe only Montessorians and Waldorf schools pay a lot of attention to, is the beauty of the classroom. If you look at a lot of, just look up online, Google something like nursery schools or daycare centers, and you start to see classrooms that are a riot of clutter, wild primary colors all over the place, uh, things hanging from the ceiling, things that are wildly distracting to the children. Both Montessori and I will give credit to Waldorf schools too, do a much better job because they speak about beauty as if that matters, and it does. So when we're talking about classroom management, and you go all the way back to that discipline and behavior topic, what I'm going to suggest is children ultimately absorb the peace and beauty of the environment and behave better in a beautiful, orderly, uncluttered environment. Without us telling them to behave, the environment tells them. The environment supports them in that, and it demonstrates calmness, order, and beauty. Well, we know that young children have the absorbent mind, and that's exactly what we hope they absorb from the environment.
Michael?
Yes, sir.
A small point on the lighting. Since there appears to be some research that suggests that the brain likes yellow light more like sunlight, on the lighting end of this the environment, I'm seeing more and more teachers, perhaps you have to put into their classroom to counterbalance the overhead fluorescent lights, if that's what they have, more incandescent lamps, a table lamp, a wall lamp, just to create a little more yellow light and a little more intimacy, and also highlighting workspace seems to be effective in helping children calm and focus.
Yeah, those are good ideas. You know what, though? You can also get what they call full spectrum lighting.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And full spectrum lighting is more expensive. I know that. But we had full spectrum lighting in my classroom for quite a while, and we didn't have it out in the hallways. And you could stand in the classroom and look out in the hallway and see the difference. You could see the difference in the color of things, because full spectrum lighting has a color temperature of a day in July. So it actually gives you true color. Things like the color tablets actually look the color they really are, and they don't under fluorescent lighting, under the traditional fluorescent lighting. And they also don't even under incandescent lighting unless it's full spectrum. Incandescent is warmer, but on the other hand, if you can even double it up and go to full spectrum lighting, and I know that's a little more spendy, it really does make for, I think, a really nice look in the classroom. But then lighting certain areas, lighting certain materials, having lighting that features something like a reading area, that's really important, John, and I think you brought that up.
I think that 2 years ago, I did my school, Renaissance Montessori, we did it full spectrum lighting throughout the entire school. I understand the cost difference, but there's a lot of rebate programs now and things that help make the switch because, fluorescents are being phased out. And so there are ways to do it, even if it's just one classroom at a time, but there are companies that come and do it, and they work with your power companies to help with that. The other thing John mentioned is that, there's research about the brain development, the neurological impact of fluorescence. There's things that we really need to look at. It's more than it just looks better. This really has a profound effect on concentration and distractibility and that neurological feeling. We have some children who can hear the fluorescence. They're so sound sensitive. And so it can be a distraction to them. And one more thing I want to add, Michael, to your original list is the clutter. Often we don't recognize our own clutter. We get used to our own clutter. It seems perfectly fine to us. And so I always ask people to come in and help each other, peer reviews, come in and look at where my clutter is. When we invite that, it helps us look at it with new eyes, because teachers will have things stacked on top of things, or a shelf that looks like to them it's out of the way, and they become accustomed to it. They have blinders onto it. And so if people can help each other and look at what we don't see for ourselves, I think that's real helpful too.
You're exactly right. And let me just go back to those 4 jobs of the teacher. The 4th one is to be a model. So if you are modeling your area as being a cluttered area, you may not be trying to tell the children that clutter is okay, but actually you are telling them that by simply having it be that way. So you don't have to verbally say it. You're a model whether you like it or not. And so that's a really good thing. Bring somebody in, and if they see that, I would suggest to the teachers, let yourself hear what they say too, rather than becoming a tendency we all probably have to become a little defensive about it. But
Michael, while you're on the subject of teacher and clutter, would you do your pitch on teacher workspace, as in no?
Like their own private little work area, which has their coffee pot and the pictures of their family and
teacher desk.
Pictures of their latest trip on a cruise and their favorite little doodads that they have. Yeah, I know I'm going over the top here.
Yeah, you're going to teacher desk.
But one of the things I do when I observe in a classroom is I try to get an estimate of its size. And don't we all kind of do that? And I want to know its square footage. And often the teachers have no clue, which is strange to me. But if the classroom is, say, 1,000 square feet, then I'd like to know how much of that is the teacher area. And in some of those classrooms, I've measured by pacing it off that it's 1,000 square feet, and the teacher area is 150 square feet. In other words, more than 10% of the classroom is devoted to one person. And that one person is not the person that's meant when we say children's house. Children's house is supposed to mean exactly what it says, children. And when the teacher takes up 1/10 of the area or more, and then 25 other people take up the other 90% instead of getting a part of that, well, there's a basic flaw in that whole picture. So you're exactly right, John. The answer is no. As you said, the fewer area. If we could take a leaf from other professions and think that in other professions, the place where they practice, the surgeon's theater, the room in which they do surgery, is not their office. The place where they perform their professional duties and their office are separate. We should get our office out of the place where we produce our professional duties. The classroom shouldn't also be our office because it's a children's house, not a teacher's office. And that's something that school designers only now are beginning to see in some schools, that teachers need. That gets them the opportunity to have the storage they want, to have those things, and get them out of the classroom where they are distracting the children. Okay? Well, you're going to say something else there, John? I'm sorry.
Just thank you for elucidating that.
Okay. Oops, I went a little far. So keep shelves relatively empty. A good way to do that is to think, You know, the height of horses is measured in what they call hands, so many hands. So think of your hand. It's probably about, well, a child's hand is about 3.5 inches, depending on their age, 3 to 5 inches, maybe about 4 inches is a typical, what we could consider a hand. That's about the space that should be between any two materials on a shelf. So if you can't put a hand down between the two materials, how is the child supposed to put her hands in on either side of the material and pick it up and take it off the shelf? If there's no room for the hand to go in there and pick up the material, then it's too tight. And if it's too tight, that inhibits choice because the child may not want to, may grab a material that's easier to take off the shelf simply because it's easier. Or it may create clutter because in taking it off, she bumps the materials next to it and then those get jammed up. Leave a hand between materials. And then another thing, all material on the shelves needs to be either in a box or in a container like a basket or on a tray. And if it doesn't have one of those things, then it needs to have something under it. So it's like goes back to the old idea that once was present in kitchens where all shelves had a shelf liner. People didn't put their plates just directly on the shelf. They put in a shelf liner first. And that helps to show the importance of the particular material, that it sits in a particular place with a piece of felt or with a oilcloth or with something underneath it, a doily, something that marks its spot and really gives it the dignity it deserves. Now, if it's in a container already, that's different. But some things really aren't already in a container. We do need to have a line and we need to have seating. Now, I suggest you have seating for 60 to 70% of the children. That opens up floor space. And what it also means is there's not enough seating for each child to have his or her own permanent seat. We can't have assigned seating if we have only 60 to 70% of the children having seats. Having assigned seating is a tendency some adults lean towards. But if we have only this much, they can't. It's a control of error that helps us from doing the wrong thing. And it also opens up the floor space because young children especially need floor space. And in the elementary, they do too, because there's many materials, like the timelines and so on, simply cannot be done on tables and ought not to be done on tables. But if you have a table and a chair for every single child and you only have 1,000 square feet in the classroom, and you have, as an elementary classroom, typically about 20 shelves, there's going to be no floor space left. So we need to control that. All right, let's go on and take a look at a couple of classrooms.
Michael, would you mind going back that slide for just a half a second? I know you've got offer a variety of workspace there, but I wanted to get your thoughts on. I'm seeing a lot of early childhood classrooms in my consulting work, as well as elementary classrooms, that are missing sufficient individual workspace. It seems to me that the first plane of development child, their developmental task is gaining concentration, focusing their attention and energy. And I even see a lot of elementary students who simply have an inability at this stage in their development, maybe because there isn't enough grace and courtesy agreements in the classroom, to focus with 4 other people sitting at a table. So I'm seeing in the design of more environments that the teachers who put into the classroom more individual or 1 or 2 person workspace produces higher levels of engagement, thus better behavior management. Your thoughts?
Well, it cuts both ways. I think you're right. In the general guideline is that in the early childhood or primary level, that that individual work is probably the central activity. And that means we need to have, look at this picture in the top left and look at how many of those tables have a single chair there. That's a primary classroom, and the idea is to allow for individual work. But at the same time, there can be the possibility of a group table here or there. But if we have all group tables, yeah, just as you said, John, it's missing something really core. Now, on the other hand, with the elementary children, group work is really a central activity. But if we only have group tables, again, we're missing we're missing that possibility that you just mentioned for individual work that children may benefit from in many cases. On the other hand, I have seen elementary classrooms where it's all individual seating, like school desks.
Yeah, that's
And that's not
imbalance.
either. That's not, I know that's not what you're suggesting,
No, no, no.
but we don't want to go to either extreme, I guess is probably the key issue there. Well, these are classroom. Did that help, John?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for elucidating that, Michael.
These are some classrooms that I thought were interesting to talk about. The one in the top left does illustrate the seating, but it gives me a sense of being barren. The contrast, the field ground contrast between the materials, the tables and chairs and that floor is not sufficient as compared with the one just below it, where you see that there's the blue carpeting and the natural wood table stands out much more nicely against that. Also, the one in the lower right-hand corner, the colored shelf, that's a toddler area. The colored shelf, which is white, stands out nicely against the natural wood, which is the floor. So I think that kind of contrast where you see both things is really beneficial in the classroom. And then if you'd also look at that lower left-hand picture, you'll notice that there is relatively appropriate spacing between the materials. But in the one on the lower right for the toddlers, there's very appropriate spacing. I think that's understanding the age level of the child. That's a very appropriate spacing for the materials. So when you're looking at the classrooms, you want to look at things like the field and the ground, the appropriate spacing, the beauty of the material. I like it that in two of these pictures, we see some natural things, some plants and so on that are in there that add softness to the whole look of the classroom. These are nice things to have. I like to talk about the room itself, but one thing that most of us can't control unless you're building a new building is the size and shape of the room. The room, you may just get what you get. According to several people like David Kahn, the room size for a primary classroom should be around 1,000 square feet, and for an elementary classroom around 1,300 square feet. Get out a ruler and measure your room and see what you think. But if it's smaller than that, then you have to cope with the possibility of very little floor space. And this little girl, for example, that we see in the picture, needs floor space to do exactly what she's doing. So we need to be sure that even if we have a small room, that we leave space for the children to work. And then I want to say a little about the entrance. One of my mentors, my AMA, I worked a lot with a woman who herself trained with Maria Montessori. And she made a big issue of the entrance to the room. And she always said to me, Michael, first impressions count. When the child walks into the room, that spot right there should be beautiful. That should not be the place where you store your cluttered theory, you store things, that they walk into a pile of piled up things first. The first thing, the first impression I want you to think about when you step into your room, just stand at the doorway and look to your left, right, and in front of you. And are you seeing things immediately that are attractive? And if not, then that's a nice call for some restructuring of that area. And I'm going to skip some of that because of time. And I will say one of the things that you need to have are chairs for an adult. You need to have at least one or two chairs I typically would like to have 2 adult chairs in the classroom. The children's chairs belong to the children. They're not ours to take. We ought not to take the chair away from a child, that even if she's not sitting in it. That's the child's chair. Sitting in the child's chair, to me, is like going and sitting on a table. That chair is for the child. Then there should be a chair for the teacher to be able to sit in, so we're not taking the chair away from them. And by the way, that's very generous to an observer who comes into the classroom and finds an appropriate place to sit. But for the children, there should be a variety of seating. Floor space, often at low tables, often at a platform, or at a regular table. And then they can use on the floor a variety of rugs or mats that define their workspace. Now, one thing that there's some apparent controversy about is whether or not there should be an area devoted to peace in the classroom, like a peace corner. And I went to a conference last summer in which a well-known Montessori person chastised all of us and said Montessori never said there should be a peace corner in the classroom, and so get them out of your classroom. There shouldn't be any. And it's true, Montessori may not have said that, but I think I'm an advocate for it. I think that a peace corner, a peace area, even if it's not a corner, just a small area for the purposes of peace, that's a great addition to the classroom. It's an important addition. And when I've done a workshop here on this webcast about peace and the development of peace in the classroom, I spent quite a bit of time on that peace corner. So I would suggest that you at least think about having a peace corner in the classroom, and that's going to have direct relationships to the management of behaviors in the classroom, because it's a neutral spot where many issues can be settled. We're going to talk about that more. Right now I'm just talking about, would you even have one? So I think that's an important thing. I do anyway. Here's some more classrooms, and you'll notice how they've done some things with corners. For example, on the top left, they created a reading area. It's comfortable, it's inviting, it's beautiful. Now, the picture on the wall on the left is too high, but I'm not going to get too worried about that. They did create a nice area, and an effort was made to make it warm and welcoming. Look at the classroom library on the top right. It doesn't have seating, but it is welcoming. It has a nice area rug in front of it where children could sit and read. It calls you to that area, and the plants are welcoming as well, and they soften that. And then the other two are sort of kitchen workspaces, and the one on the left is much more oriented to children. But it's important that we have a variety of spaces. By the way, not everybody can have a kitchen workspace in their classroom because of water. If we had our druthers, we'd probably all want water in the classroom, but many of us have classrooms that don't have that, and we have to find an alternate water source to use in the classroom. Now, John, you notice teacher desk is on the top of my list here. I was going to get to that eventually. The teacher desk, we've already talked about. We want that minimized or out of the room entirely. Minimized, for sure. Water, I just mentioned. A platform is something that in our training we use a lot. It's a raised area where students can work around, children can work around, and teachers do presentations. And then you gotta find a place for storing your own stuff that isn't just heaped on top of the shelves. So either you're gonna get it, if you don't have any storage space, you're gonna have to get it out of there somehow, because otherwise, exactly what Kathy talked about will be the case. The clutter that you create will be the clutter that you demonstrate to children, and they'll see that. So we need to get that storage in just by piling it high on top of something and thinking, well, it's piled up on top of a wardrobe in the corner. That's not good enough. It still creates a cluttered look in the classroom.
Like a one stopgap measure.
John, just let me say, here's some storage options that I wanted to show you that are storage options. And when you think about lockers, those big old metal lockers we may have had in high school when we were kids, something like these down in the lower right that are nice wooden things are just so much more friendly, I think. Go ahead, John.
I was going to say, for those people who may be attending who's either because of budget constraints or space constraints, they can't do a quick fix on stuff that's piled above cabinets, let's say, and that's creating kind of visual or neurological noise. Some teachers, as a stopgap measure, simply put a beautiful monotone cloth, like a dark blue cloth, over those things. It's not a final fix, but now the children are not berated with this enormous plethora of materials. It's just a blue cloth covering them.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, I like the mention of a blue cloth, because if we have the tendency to think, as long as I'm putting a cloth up, let's get this brightly patterned thing that has alphabet letters all over it. No, we don't want to go that direction. Now, in the top right picture here, you see the carpet on the floor, or the rug on the floor has what carpet people call a tweed pattern. And that's acceptable. That's not a solid color like you just said, but it is acceptable. It fades into, it's not going to jump out at you like covering it with alphabet letters, all held up by Mickey Mouse and friends. That's what we don't want to do that. So thanks for that suggestion, John. I'm going to skip over that, and well, I won't. I'll just say the design, the material of the shelves, and where you place them is really important. How they're set up, where they're set up, and here are some that I think look interesting to talk about. Look at the one in the lower left. Notice the hand space that's placed there between each material, down on those shelves, between those animal puzzles and so on. That's very nice. The shelf on the lower right also has relatively adequate hand space. So does the one in the upper right. The one in the top left is a little crowded. So, but all of them, people made an attempt to make them look attractive, to make them look nice, and to call to the children. And I think that's what's really important. All of these shelves have backs, and backs are very important for two reasons. One is simply structural. A back on the shelf will make the shelf live longer. It won't have its joints be broken over time, because a square or a rectangle is not a stable figure. But when you cover it up with something in the back, it makes it stable. And the second reason is that it helps the children. Many materials have orientation. There's a direction from which you should take them. We say we want the child to see it from left to right. But if you come to the shelf from the wrong direction, you don't see it that way. The back means this is the direction from which you see it. The shelf in the lower right is what I call a full back. But there are also half-back shelves. We're not talking about football here, but there are also shelves where the back comes only up halfway or a third of the way. That's enough to make the shelf rigid, but it's still, and to show the directionality, but it allows the teacher to have visual contact throughout the whole classroom. I use those half-back shelves in the middle of the room and the full-back shelves against the wall.
Michael, would you speak for a moment about, since one of the roles, as you mentioned, of the Montessori guide is observer, if you're going to have shelving with backs, how you configure those shelves in a way that as a presenting teacher, you can still scan your classroom and not have enormous blocks of visual obstruction?
Well, you don't want to have big blocks of visual of things that are going to block you out. No, you don't want to have that. If you could, I would say take the backs off those shelves, cut them in half and put them back on, so you have a half-back shelf, and then you can see through it. It's still, you can see through it, and yet it'll still have the rigidity that you want. If you're going to buy shelves to start with, there's some companies like Gonzaga Ready that sells them in either full-back or half-back configurations. And so it's nice to get about half of each, so that you know some are going to be out in the room and some are against the wall. One solution to what you talked about, John, that I see in a lot of classrooms is putting all the shelves against the wall, and that's the wrong solution. That leaves a great big open area. The entire classroom is wide open and all the shelves are lined against the wall. And the teachers do that for what you just talked about, for vision. But it doesn't make an interesting classroom. And it also creates some movement issues and behavior issues in the classroom. So what you want to do is try to set those shelves up in bays or peninsulas and islands here and there. But you want to be able also yourself to realize that you have to be mobile as an adult. You have to be able to move the class. And if it's the wrong thing for a Montessori teacher to sit at one spot and call the children to her for presentations, though I see that happen. The Montessorian has to get up and move about and can see various areas of the classroom. Many children like the sense of some privacy.
Yep.
And we need to judge that, their desire to have some privacy, against our need to see what's going on and find a middle ground that works for both.
Yep.
And that's really important. That's why those half-back shelves really help. It gives the child a sense of being in an innie, as I call it, a private place, but you actually can see in through that shelf. And so both needs are satisfied in that case.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go forward here. I'm going to just talk about the materials for a sec that go on the shelf. We need them to be clean. If you're interested, I publish an authorized materials list annually. And I go to Montessori material manufacturers and review what they're doing and publish a list of what materials are needed for each level. And that is a list from toddler through upper elementary, but I don't have it through junior and senior high school, the secondary programs yet. But if you want to, and if many people want it, I could talk with Kathy about posting it or something for you. But the materials, I'm sorry.
Yeah, we would love to have it posted. Wonderful.
Okay, well, there you go. The materials, whatever you have, whether they're from my list or somebody else's, you need to have them be in good condition. They need to be clean. They need to be repaired. They need to be beautiful. And if they're not, you need to repair them, take them off the shelf. Now, I'm going to just skip over a couple things, look at a couple more pictures here of classrooms that are interesting to discuss. The one in the middle, in the very middle with the big J on the top, that gives you an idea of what I think is too much visual noise on the wall. And if you try your best to minimize that and just think it's okay to have bare spaces, it's all right to have bare spaces, that's a big step forward. One picture on the wall might be enough. But if you'd like to have several pictures, maybe you put up just one picture and then 2 or 3 weeks later you put a different picture up, and then 2 or 3 weeks later you put still another picture, so you rotate the pictures instead of putting them all up at the same time. Okay. Finally, you need to evaluate the classroom, and one of the ways that I evaluate the classroom is to check it from the child's level. Get down on my hands and knees, get down on my tush, and look at what it looks like from 2 feet high, from 3 feet high. If I look at it from my 6 foot high level, I see it at an angle that is not the same angle that children look at it. And in order for me to get a real evaluation of how it's going to work for the children, I need to get myself down to their level. And then once the children are in the environment, we have to observe how they function in the environment, because often we need to change it. And it's easier to change the environment than to change the children. It's much easier. The environment is inanimate. It's things. Things we can move around, we can put our hands on, pick them up and put them somewhere else. Children, no. So it's much easier to move the environment if there's a problem than to discipline the children about it.
Michael, one of the things I don't very often see teachers doing in terms of observe the children in the environment is the simplest observation of simply observing for 5 minutes the faces of children engaged in work to see if they are really, generally focused on their work, or whether because of the number of children either at a workspace or how close the workspace proximity is, or the direction that their tables are facing, they're seeing a lot of, this looking around the classroom or looking at other children. If teachers would simply observe to look at the eyes of the children working, they would make some adjustments to their environment.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And in fact, not just the eyes, but any muscular movement and how they move about the classroom is really an important thing for us to look at too. Often when people talk about observation, and I brought this up when I talked about Cora a while back, that system that I teach, often when people talk about observation, they talk about observing the child. And that's an important thing. But we also need to observe areas of the environment. Look at certain areas of the environment and see how children react in those particular areas. It's good to spend some time looking at the math area and observing that, looking at the language area, looking at, are there areas that we have issues with too much running or inappropriate movement and so on. And again, if so, it's easier to alter the environment than to discipline the child. That's something to remember. If the environment can be changed, instead of trying to change the children, then let the environment do it. The environment can't nag the children. But if we keep telling them, just walk, just walk, just walk, just walk, eventually we can characterize ourselves as a nag. But the environment can't do that. But it can set behavioral standards. So these are some influences that I wanted us to go before I leave the environment. All of these great things can grow out of having a positive, prepared environment. All of these wonderful things are part of what we want proactively to be in the child to create the behaviors that we want to see happen. The learning behaviors, the cooperative behaviors, the sharing, the growing, all of these grow out of these kind of positive things if we have a prepared environment that is appropriately set forth. And I don't think there's anybody who would look at these and say, oh, well, we don't want children who are attentive, or we don't want children that respect or are independent or can concentrate. We want all of these things. And it's interesting that many of these things cannot be as easily directly taught. To sit down and say, I'm going to teach a child how to be independent, I'm going to teach her to concentrate, is probably impossible. But if we can set up a situation in which concentration can grow and develop by preparing the environment for it, and then the child uses auto-education or self-education to learn from the environment the skill of concentration, then we've achieved something that's really a Montessori goal. Okay.
Michael, I'm so pleased you began this whole two-session piece with the environment, because I'm guessing that there might be some people who've attended who thought that you were going to deal with redirection of behavior first, and you have dealt with the environment in such excruciating specificity and detail. And just in case there are any of us tuned in who are thinking that Michael's being a little nitpicky about, look for this little thing in the environment and make sure you're looking at this. If you haven't seen some of the current research on the neurological effect upon children of the environment, it's pretty solid. What Michael is describing here is not insignificant. Each of these will either determine a child's engagement or lack of same. So Michael, thank you for starting at this very fundamental level.
Well, thank you for saying that, John, because I have a strong belief, and it's backed up by a lot of not only research, but my own personal experience. And that belief is, if the environment is out of order, so will be the behaviors of the children. If you create an appropriate environment, that is necessary but not sufficient for all of the appropriate things to happen, but it is necessary. And so many people, and I keep coming back to this one thing, and I know it sounds like a crazy mantra, but it's easier to change the environment than it is to change the behavior of the children. Let the environment change the behavior of the children rather than you. And that's just so important for us to keep thinking about, that we actually, especially in Children's House, don't so much as teach, we don't teach the children particularly very much. What we really do is we set up an environment in which they can teach themselves. And if we do that appropriately, then the environment and the child interact. If we don't do it appropriately, we end up interacting with the child by trying to correct them over and over. And that's the wrong direction. That's that second definition of classroom management that's all about behavior correction.
Yeah.
We don't want to go there. We don't want to go there.
Michael, as we wrap up the physical environment part, I do have a question about how about putting student work up on the wall? How do you feel about that?
Well, I think anything you put on the wall, you have to exercise some discretion and you can't say, I have 24 children in the classroom. In order to be fair, I'm going to put up all 24 things that everybody has made all the time. You need to think, how can I have the ability to recognize the work of children and at the same time not clutter the place? That's really what you need to do. So I like the idea of featuring children's work, but if you paper the wall with children's work, and we saw that in a couple of the pictures I showed, you end up with what you've tried to avoid in the first place, which is a cluttered look. So I tend to always say I identify a particular area in the classroom. That's where the children's work will go. And we will put up maybe a certain designated number of things, 4 or 5 things perhaps in that area, and then they rotate. So those are up for a few days, and then somebody else gets something up, and then it rotates and something else is up there. Because if you manage it's just like the art. If you manage the display in terms of time, each display is up for a certain period of time. Instead of putting it all up at once, you solve the clutter problem.
Well, Michael, the other thing I just want to reinforce that you mentioned earlier, and there is research to back this up, that things that are generally above children's eye levels become visual neurological noise distraction. The children will not reference them. So whatever, as much as possible, space considerations, accordingly, put things on walls that are at children's eye level so they can actually interact with them.
Right. And I did mention that very, very briefly, but thanks for bringing it to a more of a point, because it's something that we as adults don't tend to think that way often. We tend to think, well, this is where pictures go. And so it's really good to again, if you get down on your knees or something and try to view things from the child's perspective, we get a much better idea of what it is we're trying to achieve. Okay. Planning. There are lots of things that need to be planned. You need to plan schedules. You need to plan the beginning and end of every day, and you need to plan lessons. You probably need to plan other things too, but I'm going to focus on lessons or presentations. And the reason I want to do that is because we're not good at it. Most Montessorians get the idea of, all right, what are we going to do when children arrive? How do we end the day? What is the ending ritual of the day? What time is lunch? When do we have this happen or that? When are there specialists, like there's an art teacher? Scheduling doesn't seem to me to be the problem with many of us, but planning of lessons is. And it goes back to what Kathy said a long time ago. We shouldn't have to plan, Michael. Shouldn't we just follow the child? I know, Kathy, you were not saying that I know you were challenging me on that. But I work at a particular school, and one of the teachers came up and she said, Michael, you're telling me we should plan what we do in the classroom, But I got into Montessori because I wanted to be in a field where you never had to plan anything. That is not a teacher that I would feel comfortable having my child in that classroom, because I think that planning is very, very important for us in terms of what it is we're going to present to children. We need to have lesson plans. And a lesson plan and an album aren't the same thing. The album tells you how to do it. It's kind of like a recipe book. It tells you the steps you need to do in order to bake that cake or to make those cookies. You go to the shelf, you get 2 cups of flour, you get, and so on. You go to the shelf in this case and you take out the Nabla cylinder box and you carry it to the workspace and so on. But that doesn't tell you with whom or when that's going to happen. And that's the planning part. When am I going to get that material and who receives that material? And if you start to think about the outcome of your classroom, in my primary classroom, would I like to have it that a substantial number of the children, many of the children who are capable at least, become readers? Would I like them to recognize numerals? Would I like them to understand texture? Would I like them to be able to know colors? Well, if so, we have materials for all those things. When are we going to present those, or how are we going to present them? Lesson plans offer children the entirety because you have it in writing and you can sit down and think, I need to give a sensorial lesson, I need to give a practical life. In the elementary, a geometry lesson, a history lesson, a biology lesson. You can reach the whole curriculum instead of playing favorites. And believe it or not, Montessori teachers tend, many of us, and I've done it too, to play favorites with the materials we really like. We present those more. And the fact that we really like them does not mean that that's what every child likes or should like. It doesn't mean that that's what every child needs or requires. It reflects our own taste. And that is a way that we impose our own taste on the children. That's what I call the hidden curriculum. You're not really trying to do it that way, but it happens. But if you sit down and you plan it out, you can say, oh, I'm spending a lot of time on this thing over and over. I'm always presenting these particular, a very typical one with a lot of Montessori teachers is math materials. I'm presenting this over and over and ignoring certain other things. If I write it out and plan it, I can do better lessons. I reach everyone, and everybody, I can offer a broad variety of everything in the classroom more effectively. And this is the biggest reason. If you plan things, they're likely to get done. If you don't have a plan, well, I think it's like Yogi Berra said at one point, how do you know if you're going to get there if you don't have a map? How do you know if you've arrived if you don't know where you're going? That's really an important thing. If you do have a plan, you can know what you're supposed to do and actually try to accomplish those things, get them done. So a plan really helps. And here we go, Kathy, but shouldn't we just follow the child? And I'm going to say, when we pay attention to sensitive periods, to human tendencies, human needs, planes of development, and something we do in elementary, which is called focus groups, we're actually following the child. We're not paying attention to every whim. We're looking at deep, that's why in the training, we study these very things. We study sensitive periods, human tendencies, human needs, planes of developments. We don't have a chapter on whim. That's not something we study, caprice. We study these important things because these tell us how to follow children. And so we are following the children when we do these things. Well, I'm going to say one last thing, and our time is up, because this is important to know. The children can't just take whatever they may please throughout all of elementary and primary and secondary. And the reason is, well, why not? It's because of this. There's really only one person in the whole room who actually knows the curriculum of all of the materials. But you have to know in order to be able to make a selection. You have to know what everything is. Well, there's only one person that knows the sensitive periods, the direct aims and indirect aims, who knows the goals of all the work and the long-term possibilities, and that's you, not each child. So the child may be drawn to a piece of material because of something like its color, or because her friend used it, or because it's at their hand level, or because you were looking at her and she thinks she's better grab something, or else you're going to come over and tell her to get to work. There may be all sorts of things like that. But you are one who should be able to say, based on what I know about the aims of the work, the sensitive periods of the child, the goals of our work, this is what I'm going to present next. Doesn't mean that's all she'll ever work with, but that does mean you use your knowledge. By the way, that's why we all sat through Montessori training, to learn these very things so that we can do it. Well, with that, I think it's 1:30, and I'm at my point of, it's 2:30 for you. It's at my point of conclusion. Um, what I want to do is continue with planning and then go into developing, offering better quality lessons, because well-planned classrooms with engaging work tend to create behaviors that we'd like to see. Rather than correcting the behavior, if we set this work up so that we are proactive and we're creating planned, carefully executed work, then children misbehave far less. And we don't have to go to that discipline orientation. We can go to that more or less planning orientation. Well, Kathy and John, I'm sorry, but it's 1:30 and I need to stop, I guess. And
Oh,
I
I
got about
guess
halfway through.
we have another week scheduled for you next week. I know everyone will be looking forward to that.
I
We
sure do.
do have a couple of comments I want to make sure we get in, because Dina Pollock, who's one of our very wise colleagues, has
Let me
said,
say hello to Dina.
yes, we all say hi, Dina. She says, I love the details addressed, Michael. Socrates says, an unexamined life is not worth living. Our craft requires this. The anatomy of the kind of guidance we provide to the child provides internal examination. The result of our, let's see, to create and wonder. Wonder is the beginning of wisdom. Teacher preparation is so crucial, and she thanks you. And I thank Dina always for being here.
And I want to thank you, Dina, and thank you for doing the good work you do all the time with children and with teachers in training. And I'm going to make a suggestion, Kathy, that we get Dina in here one day to talk about her whole history of her experience in Montessori, as we've done with others.
Yes, we have mentioned that several times. So, Dina, I will reach out to you, or please feel free to email me, and we will hopefully entice you to participate with us. We also have Najua, I hope I'm saying that correctly, says, hi, I was waiting for weeks for this webinar, and I can tell you that it was worth it. This was a wonderful session, and thanks a lot for this. So, Michael, I'm sure that echoes many people's experience, that the amount of preparation and planning you have put in so that people can have some ideas and some new ways of looking at things, and just get reminded and renewed. And I agree, the level of detail you're bringing, along with what John said about the neurological implications for the children, I think just really enriches our experience and our ability to be in the presence of children. So thank you again, and thank you everyone who's participating. Thank you, Jonathan, for being a member of our panel. We love it when you can join us. It certainly adds to our discussion. So thanks, everybody, and we will see you again next week. Hopefully John can participate. I know Michael will be here, and I will be here as well. So we will see you all next week. So I'm going to turn the